go ahead and get started with the second day of the symposium. Thank you everyone for attending and being here today. I'm really looking forward to the first block of talks. So the next block of talks here will move on to neural network models, spatiotemporal dynamics and neural network models, and also approaches and mathematics, and looking more broadly towards how we can fuse these things together to gain insight into the computations that are happening in machine learning models. So with that, I will introduce Andy Keller, who will give the first talk.
Yeah, you don't have to press anything. It's all right.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. All right. It's a good distance to wear this. Does that work? Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so my background is in machine learning. I did my PhD in machine learning with Max Welling in Amsterdam. I'm now doing a postdoc position at the Kempner Institute at Harvard, where the goal is to be somewhere between AI and machine learning and study just intelligence broadly. So I got involved in some projects related to computation with spatiotemporal dynamics and with Lyle, and I'm super grateful to be here today. So I'm going to start off with very high level stuff and then go into some experiments, but please interrupt anytime with questions or clarification, and we don't have to finish everything that I have here. So this slide is about 2 years old, and yet still I was looking at it again thinking, okay, this is still somewhat impressive. So this was video generation from 2 years ago, a teddy bear washing dishes. We can also see these are all generative model type of applications. This is a generative model making some mediocre music based on some text prompt. And then this is an example of the game of Go, which of course famously DeepMind beat the world champion in back in 2016. These are all super impressive, but how does this differ from our natural intelligence? Does it differ? A lot of people in the machine learning world will say, why do you even bother looking at the brain when we have this incredible performance? Well, the first thing I think is, if I can get this to go forward, if we just consider the amount of training data that these models take. So this video generation tool is 400 million text image pairs. To make this audio is 2 million clips. This Go game is 100 million matches. And you see these numbers, and I just wanted to give an example of what this really means. So if this is the entire lifetime of Lee Sedol, who was the world Go champion, and every little Go piece here is 1,000 matches. This is estimated how many games he's played in his lifetime, 50,000. Doesn't sound like that much, but if you calculate, I went through the math and like, okay, it's kind of maybe a rough approximate. So then let's see how many do we think AlphaGo had to play in a similar amount of time. And this was on a crunch timeline to get it to work in time to play him. If you watch the documentary, like they didn't have time to go too much further than this. So this is a lot, right? But this is just the first slide. So, and remember, these are in units of 1,000. So this is the second, third, if we can guess how many this goes for, it's actually 212 of these slides worth. So this is actually like an astronomical ratio, right? This is like a factor of 2,000 times as many. And this is, compared to today's standards, relatively small. If these large language models, when I was building this and writing my thesis, it was like a difference of a couple hundred lifetimes worth of like a single model. You had to be reading for a couple hundred lifetimes straight in order to read the same amount of text that this model was learning. And this was like GPT-2, GPT-3, now we're on 5 or whatever, right? You can only imagine. So astronomical sample complexity, the number of data points you need to train these models. That's a problem, right? The second problem is what I was calling unintuitive generalization. So this is one of these image generative models. You ask it to generate an image of a teddy bear on the moon, and it does this incredibly well, right? Which is impressive. Like, I don't think I could make a picture that looks this impressive of a teddy bear on the moon. But at the same time, you ask it to draw a blue cube on top of a red cube, and it fails. It does this incredible 3D rendering. Like, I could not draw these shading and these reflections like this, but it doesn't understand these object relationships. And so I call this intuitive generalization because there's a relationship here between the bear on top of the moon and the block on top of the other block, which is a really simple relationship that I think we all understand. And you can think of it kind of like a symmetry, which I'll get to. But the model clearly doesn't have this structure in its representation to be able to perform this kind of generalization. So in the machine learning world, the way that I like to think about solving both of these problems, or one kind of facet that solves both of these problems, is the notion of inductive bias. So really simply, an inductive bias is like the choices you make when you are picking your model that constrain what is possible to learn and also how you generalize. And it also constrains how many samples you need to learn that. So for example, if this is your data set, which is the price versus your house size, you can see that there's some relationship here. If you just pick a linear fit, you're going to have a high bias. You're not going to hit all the data points, but maybe you only need 2 data points and you're going to get a relatively good fit. If you pick a degree 2 polynomial, okay, I was trying to justify why a very large house would be cheaper. I couldn't quite figure it. Maybe it's like a farm or something. A lot of land, not like no electricity, something like this. So it goes down. If you pick a really high degree polynomial, right, this is a different type of inductive bias. You can fit all the data, but you're not going to generalize, but probably not going to generalize as well, for example, to this house price or this house size right here. You're going to predict some really high value of the house price. So this is just one example of inductive bias. It's a choice of your model that determines how you generalize and how much data you need. And I think one of the most famous examples recently in the deep learning space is this idea of convolutional neural networks, where we're sharing weights over space. This is arguably what caused kind of the resurgence of deep learning in 2014, these things working on the image classification data set. This is a type of inductive bias. And so my question, and what I was really interested in, is what are the inductive biases of natural intelligence that separate them from these models? And I guess what I got interested in, and what I'm not going to kind of belabor, or I don't know what the right word is, talk about too much, is these traveling waves, spatiotemporal dynamics in neural systems. We got amazing talks yesterday. I'm just going to show the videos so everyone believes still we're refreshed that they're still there. This is on the left is a video of theta waves traveling over the hippocampus, and this is a video from one of Lyle's papers on these waves during sleep, these global waves. And then again, we saw this video yesterday. This was in area MT of the marmoset, these waves that John was showing. So I got really interested in these types of dynamics and thinking, okay, we know that the brain is spatially organized. We have these kind of smooth spatiotemporal dynamics. Might these, in some sense, if you have a computational system that's based on these types of primitives, what are the inductive biases of that system in general? So what are the inductive biases of spatiotemporal dynamics? In this talk, I'm going to try to convince you at a very high level. One argument is that this is a relatively new idea, so please feel free to tear into me. At the highest level, maybe you can think of the inductive bias as something like a conservation of energy. So the wave equation, the simplest possible wave equation, is known to have a conserved energy. We can figure out what that energy is, combination of your kinetic and potential energies. This energy doesn't change over time. But if we think of this more abstractly, maybe there's just some kind of conserved quantity in this system. And if you think of spatiotemporal dynamics, it's kind of flowing, moving activity from one space to another and conserving some overall quantity. And maybe that can be used by a model to store important facts about the world that are invariant, that aren't changing. Or as like a sort of place to put things when the time is evolving. So this idea of conservation of energy, I put it in quotes because obviously these waves in the brain are not kind of like perfect wave equations. We may have some damping, decay, but I would say maybe over short time scales, small spatial regions, it's a fair analogy. And I'm going to argue that this leads to a bias towards this integration of information, both over space and time, and what I call encoding of continuous symmetries. And so these are two super like high level abstract ideas. So if it doesn't make perfect sense, please interrupt me and feel free to argue, or don't worry about it and just look at the results. But I have a lot of models here. So what do I mean by spatial integration of information? This is a paper that we just submitted to CCN, and they're going to be presenting at a workshop in iClear. Imagine looking at this little piece of an image here. You're a single neuron, and this is your receptive field. You're looking at this. It may be hard for you guys to see, but this kind of looks like a little patch of sky or something. There's clouds here. So if you are this neuron, how do you know what you're looking at in that receptive field? Well, it turns out maybe it's not sky, maybe it's a reflection off a lake or something like that. And so the only way to figure that out is to actually integrate information from other parts of the image, especially if you're a little locally constrained neuron. So this is what I mean by integration of information. You can imagine neurons in V1 that have a localized receptive field. How do they actually know about what's coming from outside? I think people will call these like these extended receptive fields or non-classical contextual effects. So motivation for how maybe waves are related to this. One way that you can think about it, the way that we chose to think about it for this project, and I think is kind of inspiring mathematical motivation, comes from this problem: can one hear the shape of a drum, from Mark Kack? I think it was in the 60s or something. The idea being that if you run a wave equation on some surface that has a fixed boundary condition, so on a drum, you have a drum and you have a surface on it, and you hit the drum and the drum starts vibrating like this, can you tell what the shape of this boundary is just from the frequencies that this drum is vibrating at? So to give you a little bit of an example, if we look at a slightly larger drum, so this is a drum with side length 13, this is 23, you can see the larger drum looks like maybe the fundamental frequency is a little bit slower. And if we go even larger still, you can see, okay, it seems like it's getting even slower, and maybe like an intuition for why that would be is these waves have to go all the way from the center to the periphery and back, and the whole thing has to oscillate to get the fundamental frequency. So these are the eigenmodes of the Laplacian operating on this surface. So if we look at this more precisely, if we take a single point on this surface, we plot its displacement, we take the FFT of that, we see that, or the Fourier transform, we see there's a peak in the frequency spectrum. If we look at a larger drum, you can see, okay, yeah, definitely the fundamental frequency is a lot slower. And again, this peak has actually moved a little bit lower. Just aligns with our intuition that larger drums make lower frequency sounds like boom, boom versus pop, pop, pop. So potentially then, the idea is that if you have a drum or a surface of some sort and a wave is propagating on this, when it hits a boundary condition and reflects, potentially it's actually bringing information about that boundary back to the center, and these waves kind of mix until eventually every point at the interior of this drum is going to have a frequency spectrum that looks similar when you've reached kind of this steady state. So the idea is, okay, maybe waves can propagate, and this is like a way of sharing information about what's happening. So we thought we would like to use this for something like some sort of image feature extraction. So the idea of being you have an image, you have little neurons that have little localized receptive fields. We run some sort of oscillatory local wave dynamics on that kind of space, this neural, whatever we want to call it, we'll call it our simulated cortex or something like this. And we can record from a single one of those neurons, and we get out this time series representation of its activations over time. And this is actual recording from one of these artificial neurons. And then maybe we can use this to try and classify what that individual neuron saw. And if we can decode from this signal that that neuron was able to see something larger than its actual receptive field. For example, this neuron only has a receptive field on the inside of this square. it doesn't know if this is a square or a star or a pentagon. If we can decode the actual class of the image here, maybe that tells us that these waves are actually integrating this information over space. And I'll just say that this was really driven and inspired by this work from Lyle and Roberto and Alexandra and Luisa, which when we saw it and they have this analytic solution of waves kind of traveling over these shapes for image segmentation, it really, yeah, is what made us think about this. So highly recommend checking out this work. Okay, so we wanted to run this on more complex shapes. So we did. This is a video of us running it on a pentagon shape just to show a pretty video. But the idea being, like I said before, we feed in these input images. Individual neurons have relatively small receptive fields. And then what we need to do is classify the different shapes. So the color corresponds to the class label here. So we want the network to output, for example, value of 0 here, 1 here, 2 here, even though all of the individual neurons only see a very small fraction. So you can imagine if this neuron is at the center, how does it know whether it's inside of this pentagon versus inside of this triangle? It needs to get information from the outside. So this is a video of the network actually doing this. It's a network that's simulating the wave equation, but with learned parameters, both in the lateral couplings and also in the input encoder and in the decoder. And what you can see is that, oh, the videos are very choppy up here. You can see that the network has learned in the encoder to process a feature kind of on the side of the objects here. The waves propagate around. And because of the way that the model has learned to encode the images, this is the location of the input stimulus here. The waves are actually bouncing off of this boundary. The boundary is caused by differences in natural frequencies of the object. And I'm not going to go into the details here. But basically, at the end, if this was a little less choppy, you would see that there's different dynamics on the inside of the shapes versus on the outside of the shapes. And you can quantify these with something like a Fourier transform. So that's what we did. If you just look at the Fourier transform of these dynamics at every point in space separately for these images, you can see that the different shapes really pop out in different frequency bands. So at the higher frequency, maybe you have the triangle. At these lower frequencies, you have the pentagon or something in between. And then the very lowest ones, you have the background here. And so this is just showing over the entire data set. You can see that the different shapes, such as the background, are at the lowest frequencies. You have the triangle here, and then maybe the square up here, or something like this. This is the spectrum of these different shapes in this model. This was just for fun. You can also hear, you can actually hear what these, we can synthesize these sounds and hear what it sounds like. Let's see. So that's the background. And then maybe let's go to the square. So I can hear the difference. That's okay. So also this extended to slightly more complex data. Obviously, this is not like the most complex thing. Another image of different like simple polygons. We also did it for this MNIST data set. So these simple handwritten digits, having the model try to classify what type of digit was written there based on the waves that were propagating around. I'll note that one of the cool things about this was that these models, I didn't go into the model details here, but this model is a model where the recurrent dynamics are derived from the wave equation. So it's really trying to model wave dynamics in the hidden state of the model. This model is not at all like that. It has no bias towards wave dynamics. It's actually an LSTM model, long short-term memory, a type of standard recurrent neural network model that doesn't have a notion of wave dynamics. But it looks like the model has kind of learned to do something kind of like waves in order to solve this integration of information task. And I'll show another example later where basically it looks like if we have models that have locally constrained connectivity and they need to solve a task that requires this integration of information, they end up learning something that looks like a wave type of solution, which I think is pretty interesting. Just to give some numbers, actually, I don't even know if this is worth showing. these wave models do better than some other machine learning models like UNets for segmentation. It does better than if you just stack a bunch of deep convolutional layers. Normally, the way that people integrate information over space in an image model is by stacking a lot of layers. So I can show you the image of that, this CNN again here. You can see you have a bunch of layers and you do this pooling and subsampling. And basically you think as you go deeper in the hierarchy, you're getting more information because you're kind of this tree grows outwards. But what we showed is that actually you don't need this depth. You can just have a single layer and this kind of local recurrence in here. And this is equivalent, and we're able to actually do some of these tasks better than having a lot of depth. Obviously, this is a super simple task. And so we need to extend this to more realistic data sets if we're going to convince anybody in the machine learning community, but I think it's an interesting result regardless. Something that people were discussing yesterday, which I think is really cool, so I decided to include this slide. So what we were comparing with these models was how we read out the information from this time series of activations of our neurons. So every neuron is doing its recurrent dynamics, and it has this kind of waveform, and we have to try to predict what thing that neuron is looking at based on the waveform. So we can either take the final hidden state of that waveform and use that to classify. That works relatively poorly. We can take the Fourier transform of that waveform and try to classify. That does a little bit better, but it actually seems to do the best if we just give an arbitrary linear transformation of that waveform over time and then learn what that linear transformation is, which makes it's like fully flexible. But I wanted to see what we would learn in that case. And the cool thing is, and these are rows of that matrix on the left. So these are all different features that the model is pulling out of this time series. And to me, what this looks like is something like a kind of like a windowed Fourier transform, or like a wavelet transform type thing, right? So it's looking at one frequency. You can ignore these for now. It's looking at one frequency at this point in time, and then later in the time series, maybe a different frequency, or it's just kind of ignoring it, picking up noise. And so it seems like there's maybe these kind of transient dynamics that it's trying to pick up that really depend on time in order to do this classification process. So I thought that was potentially relevant to the discussion yesterday. So that was waves integrating space. What time are we ending? Okay. Okay. That's good. So the next part is waves potentially integrating information over time. So how do we think about that? This was a generated video by Sora last night. So if it looks weird, it's because it is. The idea being that intuitively you drop pebbles in a pond. The surface of this pond encodes information about the time and the position where you drop those pebbles at different points in time. And so we can think of this kind of like wave field as kind of integrating this information of the disturbances over time. You can always look at the surface of the pond and it'll tell you a bit of history. So what we wanted to see is, okay, can we integrate something like this into a recurrent neural network architecture? Can we add waves to a recurrent neural architecture similar to we did before in order to get a sort of memory type of benefit in the machine learning sense on the really simple tasks? So if I'm going to show you some plots here, I'm going to try to have them make sense. These are our units, our neurons on the y-axis, and we're plotting time steps for some generic sequence classification, sequence processing task on the x-axis. And the color is the value of the activation. For a simple RNN, these are RNNs that have a ReLU activation function and then linear weights. So all these neurons are connected to all the other neurons. There's some input vector x that's being fed into my hidden state at every time step, and then I'm thresholding it. And you can see the dynamics, maybe not so well, but they're just kind of like, I would call them like bump activity. A given neuron comes on for a while and then it goes off, and maybe the activity goes to other arbitrary neurons where it's connected to through the recurrent matrix. If we plot this as a video, we see, okay, yeah, we get these sort of bump type of dynamics. So how do we build something like a wave model? Well, the simplest idea, and there's a lot of explanations for this, and I can, a lot of intuition to get from this, but at a high level, basically all we have to do is replace this fully connected recurrent matrix with a locally connected version. In this case, we're using a convolution operation. So convolution of a small kernel with our hidden state. So over this spatial dimension, we do a little convolution operation. And what this results in is our dynamics start to follow these like flow trajectories. So the slope here is the velocity of a wave or advection. The activation kind of moves over space through time. And if we plot it as a video, we get something that looks slightly more wavy. And you can derive this from, if you take the advection equation, so just first order in time, derivative of the hidden state is equal to first order in time derivative with respect to space. You can, and you do a finite difference approximation, you can get this equation out. So it's kind of like an approximation to a simple wave. Okay, so what do we want to do? We wanted to test these models on really simple tasks. There's a copy task. The idea being you give the model this input sequence. This is the time dimension again. You give it this input sequence of some arbitrary combination of these points. You give it a go signal at some later point in time after a delay period. And then after that delay, it has to repeat this signal that you gave it in the beginning. So this is the input, this is the target. And what we see is if we compare our wave model in red to basically the exact same model here, but the difference being that this U matrix is initialized to an identity matrix, which has been shown to work well for long sequence processing because it has these nice kind of stability processes or properties. And instead we replace it with this simple convolution. We learn kind of exponentially faster on this copy task for a variety of different delay periods. And it gets much better, or the gap gets much more significant as we increase that delay period t. So this is kind of exciting. We had a ton of different experiments that were showing the same thing. Yeah. Right. So these simple RNNs are relatively bad at waiting for any amount of time before trying to repeat. And I can give you intuition for that, but we tried this on a variety of different tasks. This is like a little simple adding task with different lengths of sequences, sequence integration tasks. I'm not going to go into all of them. Basically, just look at the red curve versus the blue curve, and you see that this type of model does better on these sequence integration tasks than the simple baseline RNN model. So these are two really simple RNNs, but I think it kind of did, to some extent, show this argument that wave dynamics, at least in a simple form, can be used to do something like storing information over long periods of time. And I really do think it has to do with this conservation of energy property. And one thing I didn't mention, but I will now, is this convolution operation inherently gives you a symmetry over space of your weights. And that's actually crucial to getting this conservation of energy. And I think that's really important. Basically, if you don't have a symmetry of your connectivity over this spatial dimension, your waves will die out at some point, or they could die out at some point, and you're not going to get this nice memory property. So, okay. Oh, yeah, sorry, with respect to this spatial dimension here. So if I imagine laying all my neurons out, this is all my neurons laid out kind of like this in a line, then I'm applying a little convolutional kernel, and it's the same as it is here, as it is over here. So if I actually look at, you can write this as a linear operator in the same form as that, and it's going to be like a diagonal Toeplitz matrix. Yeah.
Actually, so that way of looking at it is from the convolutional piece actually quite related to the way we look at it in terms of a ring graph or with a circular matrix, both of which are clearly have clear relationships, the convolution and the circular matrices. that we study. And so, and we think about those in terms of like circular matrices, which are a special form of tokens.
Yeah.
Maybe something we can expand on later.
Thank you. Yeah. So, okay, that was in these really simple models. Can we extend this? I don't know if people have heard about state. I know some people have heard about state space models here. I was talking to them yesterday, but can we extend this to kind of larger models that people are really interested in the machine learning community today? Again, I'm not going to go too into detail because I don't think it's super interesting from a neuroscience perspective, but it is interesting from the waves perspective. So these large state space models are models that are used to compete with transformers. If you've heard about these architectures, it's kind of a recurrent version or a recurrent competitor to these transformer models for doing language modeling tasks and things like that. So a paper came out where they were making these models work well for language modeling for the first time. Previously, they were working really well for long sequence modeling, but they weren't working for language. Nobody could figure out why. These people wrote this paper called Hungry Hungry Hippos, and they built this specific block architecture that was meant to, it really looks something like a transformer. If you're familiar with a transformer, you have these key value query, and they're trying to emulate this idea of attention. The details don't matter so much, but what is interesting is that it's actually made of two of these state space models. So when people say state space model, you can think of it as just a linear recurrence relation. So you have a hidden state, you have your previous hidden state, you have some matrix that maps you between the two, and you have an input that's kind of getting read in. You also have an output that's getting read out at each point in time. What they did is say, okay, in the machine learning literature, you can make this really fast with some computational tricks. You can initialize A in a fancy way to give you nice properties and dynamics. Here, they stack two of these things on top of each other. So this is the state space model with a diagonal A matrix. This is a state space model that has a shift A matrix, which is interesting. So what is this shift SSM part? Well, it's actually just A is this kind of off-diagonal shift matrix. What's cool about this is that this is actually very similar to, like you said, these circulant matrices or the Toeplitz matrix that we were talking about before. And you can actually derive this from, like I was saying, the finite difference approximation of this advection equation, this really simple wave equation, if you want to call it that. But this is velocity equal to 1 and no boundary conditions here. So the boundary is like things fall off the edge. So this is velocity equal to 1, and they put this in here, and they argued that this thing actually, in their paper, was to serve as a little form of memory, like a short-term memory for the model to allow it to compare different tokens to each other. So I told people there's waves in these models, there's waves in Mamba, and nobody believed me. So I had to like make a million visualizations of this. So this is videos, this is the hidden state again over time, and you can see these diagonals. I plotted these waves. I took the 2D FFT. I was doing the stuff that Lyle showed me and taught me how to do. So like really tried to convince you, okay, there are waves in these models, and it's constrained to a velocity of 1. And actually, it's not just this one model that's doing this. All of the state-of-the-art state space models that people have come up with from a variety of different groups all build on this exact same architecture because this seemed to work really well for them. So I was showing people, okay, there are waves in these models, but the velocity is constrained to 1. So in the previous work, we found that if we let the velocity vary a little bit, it works significantly better. So I thought maybe I could do the same thing with this Mamba model. So I did. I allowed it to have a more flexible velocity. You can see that causes kind of some blurring between the elements over time, but we can have like a larger hidden state, and we can have these, this is a visualization of the activity propagating over this one-dimensional hidden state. You can see waves are kind of propagating at different velocities and in different subspaces or different channels, we call them. So I called this new wave Mamba. Yeah. Which matrices you mean? Yeah, so this is I guess it's in the original state space model papers. This thing is actually not trainable. the shift SSM A matrix and Mamba is not trainable. So what we allow is we allow it to be trainable, but just kind of this velocity parameter is trainable. So it is a type of initialization, but with slightly more flexibility. And so again, we tested on this copy task where, oh wow, the colors on here are very different. It sees a sequence, it gets the separator, it has to repeat the sequence. And basically compared to the original model, this is this new wave Mamba, learns exponentially faster, reaches lower training loss. So that's cool, like adding variable velocity waves in our model, which you can think of maybe as like multi-time scales type of memory, seems to help a lot. Yeah, people got a lot of press recently. They wrote this paper, transformers are better than state space models at copying. And they showed all these plots that state space models really suck at copying, transformers do really well. It turns out if we add our variable wave velocities, we can approach the performance of transformers. So these are two transformers here, these two lines. This is the original Mamba model, and then this is our model here, and you can see it's reaching somewhere in between these two transformer models. And then if we go even really long sequence length, this is training iterations and our training loss. We can see the kind of this new wave Mamba model is approaching these transformer models, where the regular Mamba model is taking like 100 or 1,000 times longer to train. So this maybe goes a little bit to your point. Like I said, when we are building these models, you can think of it like a convolution. So you get this symmetry over space. Even if you it's helpful to initialize that convolutional kernel to something that approximates a wave, the advection equation. So that ends up being something like this. We can go over the derivation of that later if you want, but this gives you the finite difference implementation of the advection equation. But even if you just initialize it randomly, the model will eventually learn to do something that looks like waviness, kind of similar to like I was talking before, in order to solve this memory type of task. So it seems like this is a kind of a, I don't know, good solution. I won't say optimal, but good. So that's the integration of information part. Now I'm going to go into what is maybe slightly more confusing, but I think exciting encoding of continuous symmetries, which is still, yeah, going to be a little bit hand wavy again, but hopefully have some interesting results. So what I'm going to argue is that having these spatiotemporal dynamics is potentially a bias towards encoding the symmetries of the world. This is a super cool paper that I mentioned at dinner last night. Symmetry and simplicity spontaneously emerge from the algorithmic nature of evolution. It's just cool. Not super related to what I'm going to talk about right now, but the idea being nature has a lot of these symmetries in it. Maybe if we have a model that wants to encode nature efficiently, it can respect these symmetries. So maybe at a simpler level, why do we bother kind of thinking about symmetries in a machine learning model? There's a number of papers from the lab where I did my PhD and others who are arguing that symmetries are kind of the most natural decomposition of the world into its constituent parts, such as you can think of spatial position being a translation symmetry, maybe color as a rotation symmetry through color space, the symmetries of like SO3, the rotations of an object, or another symmetry. And I think there's some evidence that animals even also have kind of innate biases towards some symmetries, and humans as well. So I recommend these papers if you're interested in that from the kind of machine learning representation theory side. So how do we build networks that respect symmetry? Well, there's this field of machine learning called equivariant neural networks. It gets relatively technical, so I'm not going to go too much into the details, but the basic idea for you to remember in order to make sense of what I'm going to show you is that if F is your neural network and you have some transformation that's acting on your input, so you imagine a rotation of your input or a translation of your input, what I want for my function F is that it's equivalent to if I had just processed the original input and then I'm doing some equivalent transformation in the output space. So their F is kind of like a mapping that respects the structure of this transformation. So the simplest example of this is convolution. If I have an input image and I apply a transformation to it, such as translation, so I'm shifting this F from here to the other side of the image, and then I apply my convolution operation. This is convolution with this little kernel. I get out this little edge detector feature map up here. This is like a little Gabor filter. This is equivalent to if I had first convolved my image, I get this feature map, and then I translate the output of that, right? So this is this commutation relation between these two things. These two arrows meet up over here. And so if you have this property, you can say my network respects this symmetry, this translation symmetry, and this is super beneficial. Like the main, this is convolutional neural networks, how they are data efficient, parameter efficient. I'm sharing the parameters of this little kernel over all of space, right? If I learn something over here, it automatically generalizes to something that's happening at a different spatial location. And so people have argued that this is not super biologically plausible, despite the fact that the original convolutional neural networks were inspired by retinotopy in the brain and the idea that you have kind of similar feature detectors at a bunch of spatial positions. When I talk to people, everyone says, well, yeah, but you can't share weights in the brain. I can't constrain my neurons at one location to exactly have a similar, exact same receptive field as they have at another location. And so I think there's a variety of mechanisms that maybe could come into play to induce something like that. But what I'm going to talk about here is how, at a really high level, what is the relationship that I think between spatiotemporal dynamics and these types of symmetry respecting models. And this is from this perspective paper that we were working on with Lyle and Tarasinovsky and my PhD advisor, Max Welling. The idea being, if the world transforms slowly, you're observing some kind of slow, continuous symmetry transformation in the world, and your kind of hidden state is undergoing this slow, continuous spatiotemporal transformation. I say hidden state, but I guess like your neurons in your brain, the activity of those neurons. Maybe this kind of closes this loop that I was showing you before. So your input undergoes some transformation. You have maybe like a little orientation hypercolumn or something like this, and the activity is flowing around that simultaneously. Here's an image of some animal undergoing some motion transformation, which you can think of like a symmetry. This is preserving the identity of the horse, despite the fact that it's changing its position. And you have your activity kind of flowing in the hidden state simultaneously. This is super high level conceptual sketch. Okay, so how do we operationalize this to build something that's actually interesting in the machine learning world? Well, we can take this oscillator model from before, the model that I introduced at the very beginning that was doing these waves to integrate information over space, these wavy dynamics. We're going to take the exact same thing. So this is a recurrent neural network that's parameterized as a network of coupled oscillators. You can ignore the equation. It doesn't really matter if it's basically a harmonic oscillator, second order in time derivative, and then each oscillator is coupled to all the other oscillators. And again, we're using this convolution, so we have this symmetry over space. I can turn this equation into two discrete time equations. So second order differential equation, I can turn into these two first order equations. And then I can train the model. So basically at every time step, Z is kind of where how my neurons are activating, and they're doing this oscillation. At every time step, I can decode from that Z to try and reconstruct the input at the next time step. So the model is trying to do one step ahead forward prediction of the sequence that it's seeing. So for example, here the input is this little rotating 5-digit over time. This gets encoded as some driving force on the hidden state. The hidden state undergoes these wavy oscillator dynamics, and then at every time point, I try to decode that back to reconstruct the input at one step ahead in the future, something like predicting the future a little bit. And so, okay, we see we can do that for MNIST, and we get cool wave dynamics in the latent state, but what does this really telling us, so we used, again, the method that was introduced before of taking the Hilbert transform, computing the phase, the gradient of the phase. We can see at the beginning of training, the model has no sort of dynamic, no spatiotemporal structure. But then by the end of training, in order to learn these rotation transformations, the waves have aligned. And someone introduced this phase alignment or gradient alignment metric, which I want to measure on this. But you can see very clearly the waves are all going in a single direction. I'll note that we do have circular boundary conditions here, so the waves are kind of on a torus. And so to argue roughly that this is really learning something like this equivariant structure automatically, we can try to see if it satisfies something like a commutation relation like this. So the input transformation is this rotation happening down here. If I encode the initial input, I get some hidden state. We know what our waves look like because we figured out this kind of flow field from before. So I can just take my original input, apply the waves, and then decode. And what I see is that I actually match up with what the input transformation would have been for that period of time, and I can keep going. So basically, trying to show here is that there's kind of this homomorphism between, the model has learned this homomorphism between the input transformation and the wave dynamics in the latent space. And we see that this is for all of the digits of the MNIST data set. For digits that the model was not trained on, these are held out. We show it these sequences. It produces a different wave pattern for each different type of input. And then these are able to reconstruct these sequences. So it's like the identity is somehow encoded in so the actual details of the specifics of the image are encoded in the wave fronts themselves. And then the propagation direction is encoding this rotation pattern. We can do this on other data sets. So these are really simple, like it was called the Hamiltonian dynamics data set, orbiting bodies or a bouncing ball. We see we get other types of interesting dynamics here. In some cases, it's these standing waves. We can do even more complicated data sets. There's a really small network. So at some point, the hidden state starts to not look as smooth and continuous. But I still think it's really relatively interesting. And it competes relatively well with kind of these state-of-the-art sequence prediction models at doing, this is forward prediction on a bunch of these different sequence modeling tasks like the spring or the pendulum. This is our model over here. We see that we can predict 300 steps into the future relatively accurately, or 150 steps. And this is similar to these other models like the LSTM or a neural ODE. Okay, the last thing I'll show is something that we found that's really, I thought was cool. I didn't quite know how to explain it, but I think it is related to the ideas at a high level. This is the hidden state of that model processing one of these rotating MNIST digits again, or actually this may have been just a rotating kind of sinusoidal grading. And what I measured was, okay, for every neuron, what is its selectivity with respect to different oriented gradings after I train it to do this task of like forward prediction, just like a simple sequence modeling task. And what I found is that without kind of imposing anything like this, we get spatially smooth, continuous selectivity with respect to these different orientations. So this is how much does this neuron respond to this line versus this line, and I can measure the normalized difference of response properties between these different oriented gradings. So I thought that was pretty cool. Looks maybe very roughly similar to something like these orientation pinwheels and visual cortex. Have not quantified it more than that, so please take it easy on me. So that's a cool thing, and I think a lot of people wonder when you talk about traveling waves in cortex, how does it align with this idea that you have this kind of crystalline organization? Are these things fighting each other? And I think maybe we can start to think of them as being more complementary than the other way around. And I think, yeah, some of like the modeling work that you guys are doing as well is pointing to that. Okay, so Do I have time for one last part? Okay. The final part is a bit crazy. Here we are mostly talking about symmetries with respect to these kind of feed-forward transformations like rotation or translation or something like that, that you think of the transformation is not really changing in time. If we're thinking about recurrent neural networks generally, and especially like in an embodied setting, a natural setting, a common transformation is motion transformations. And this is also one of the like big symmetries in physics, is like symmetries with respect to inertial reference frames that are moving over time, so changing over time. So if we think of an equivariant neural network as doing the same processing in different reference frames, so it's doing the same processing of my image, whether I'm in this reference frame or this reference frame. Maybe the ideas of relativity and Galilean relativity and also Einstein, so that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames. So whether you're moving at some velocity or you're stationary, because velocity is this relative quantity, the laws of physics are going to be the same. So I wanted to see, okay, maybe we could build a Galilean equivariant recurrent neural network, or just a relativistic type of recurrent neural network, where its processing that it's doing is the same in all inertial reference frames. What would that mean for a recurrent neural network to have an inertial reference frame? So in physics, an inertial reference frame, you're given two reference frames. You have to define your inertial reference frame with respect to another one. It's one that's moving at a constant velocity with respect to some other ones. There's a little boat here. In a recurrent neural network, what would be a inertial reference frame? Well, if we take our hidden state, H, and this is a bunch of neurons. Here I'm drawing it continuous, but you can think of it as discrete as well. And we lay out those neurons, and we call each one of those neurons like a discretization of space. So these are my hidden state neurons. This is the activity of those neurons, and so these neurons are showing a little bump of activity here. What would be an inertial reference frame? If this is space, it would mean that we're looking at this space over, okay, sorry. There's some time dynamics that are happening as well to this hidden state. So maybe over time, there's like kind of like a standing wave type of pattern that's happening on this hidden state. What would be the equivalent of looking at this from an inertial reference frame? It would just be seeing this thing in motion, right? Maybe this thing is moving, maybe I am moving. You can't say, velocity is a relative quantity, but we know that this is kind of the transformation of this into an inertial reference frame, or viewed from a moving frame. So what would it mean to build a network which is equivariant with respect to this motion? And I guess to give a bit of motivation first, the idea is like we had these properties of generalization from convolutional neural networks that they can automatically generalize to different spatial positions, right? Like if something's here versus up here, I automatically can, what I learned down here generalizes to up here. What I want to do is I want the same thing to happen for a recurrent neural network. If I see something static and I learn how to do a task that's static, if suddenly I'm moving my head or the thing is moving a little bit, I want to be able to still be able to do the task. I want to be able to perform the same. So, okay, how do we formalize that in terms of equivariance? If I have my input sequence and I apply this Galilean transformation that shifts my input over time, I want this to be the same, and then I process this kind of new input sequence that's moving with my recurrent neural network. I want this to be the same as first just processing the static input and then shifting my hidden state, right? So the idea being that if my input is shifting in time, my hidden state should also be kind of shifting in time. Another way to say this is that my recurrent neural network should work the same in all inertial reference frames. A simple linear RNN does not have this property. So what I'm showing here in these top plots is actually the difference between those two arrows in the previous plot. So if I were to plot transforming the input and then processing it versus processing and then transforming the output, I'm going to get two different lines. These are my hidden states over time. And they should match up if it's equivariant. In this case, they definitely don't match up. And this is a linear RNN, which is some random initialization processing this moving input down here. If I build a convolutional RNN, you may think, okay, convolution, spatial equivariance, that'll work. Actually, it doesn't quite match. It matches when the variance is relatively low and things are constant. Then as soon as it starts to differ a little bit, you see this massive separation. It's kind of like it's lagging behind. So how do I build something that doesn't have this property where these things actually exactly match? And again, not going to go into the details, but the idea is that your hidden state actually needs to be moving. You need to apply the Galilean transformation to your hidden state simultaneously as your input is moving. So you have to think of it as like your neural network is in the same reference frame as the moving input. So if your input is transforming, but your neural network is kind of also moving simultaneously with it, then you're going to be processing it as if it was static, so to speak. Where this transformation is this Galilean transformation that I showed you before. So this is just comparing the two things. The cool thing about this, I guess, in relation to waves is that this transformation is exactly like that advection equation that I had showed before, which was generating these kind of wave trajectories in that simple RNN model. So this idea being, if you can kind of track an input as it's moving with a moving reference frame, you gain this property of processing it in its reference frame and then as if it were static. Okay, so I'm going to show really quickly. I'm not going to show these videos anymore. I'm going to show these space-time plots. Okay. It's just a version of this that's static in space and time. And then if it's moving, it looks like it's shifted like this. I trained this on these really simple classification tasks. Like this is space. There's an activation here over time, and it has to detect if this kind of like one column is slightly more elevated than the others. There's a bunch of negative examples where there's no signal. It's a binary task. It just has to tell me, is this bump here or not? And then at test time, I apply this Galilean transformation. So I move the bump, and I want to see, can it classify this still? Basically, the convolutional RNN fails miserably. This is the difference between training and testing. But the move data set versus the original stationary data set, we see when the input is moving, a regular RNN fails miserably. If I have these Galilean equivariant models that have this kind of moving reference frame, they work really well. And similarly on other data sets that I'm not going to go into, you can apply it to like fish tracking data sets. You have these little fish that are swimming around. The model has to detect these fish. Turns out it's able to detect these fish a little bit better if I have this property of this Galilean equivariance built into my model. Marginally better. Okay, the final point, which is kind of crazy, is that was for these first order advection equation dynamics. So this equation is, the reason this works is because this equation doesn't change if I do this Galilean transformation of my coordinates. The equation is invariant with respect to this change of coordinates. If you use a wave equation, it's no longer invariant with respect to this change of coordinates. It's actually, now this is special relativity. This equation is now only invariant with respect to a Lorentz transformation, right? So this is where you get the weird effects of time dilation, length contraction. So what does that mean? Well, it means if neural dynamics do follow something like this, you might get some sort of weird perceptual effects when things start to move really fast. And it turns out that this is something I'm working on now, more speculatively. There are some psychophysics experiments where they show that people have these subjective Lorentz transformations in some settings. So that's something I'm quite interested in and maybe related to this. So conclusion, spatiotemporal dynamics are maybe an inductive bias towards integration of information over space and time. I think this is potentially somewhat not too controversial. And then this is the maybe more controversial part of encoding symmetries in the world. So yeah, thanks to everyone here for listening and people who contributed to this work and my funding.